If you come here for the first time today and you are unsure of the series we're in, it's a series called Why Should I Care? And we're about 4 or 5 weeks in, and we went through a great introduction on culture and why we should care about culture, but we've also covered topics like mental health, news and views, war and peace, and politics. So all very exciting. And today I have a great privilege to talk about poverty and equality. Why should we care? So I spent the first 25 years of my life living in Mumbai, a city whose current population is just under 20 million people. And it is a city where 55% of its people live in slums, but the average cost of a 3-bedroom flat is around £300,000, making it one of the world's most expensive places in terms of real estate. The city is also home to the Bollywood film industry that earned $1.9 billion in box office sales in 2022. Please don't ask me to demonstrate, but there's a little picture for you. And at the same time, in terms of traffic, there are commuter trains in this city that carry 7.5 million people to work and back every day. And in trains that are meant to have a capacity for 2,000, they carry 5,000 people. But it is also home to people like this family called the Ambanis, who a few months ago, it is estimated that they spent £120 million for the wedding of their son. So I spent 4 years being a reporter for a newspaper in the city, traveling in trains and taxis, chasing stories, interviewing people, and going from one contrast of this city to another. One day, I might have been covering like a huge water shortage in a slum. Another day, you'd find me interviewing a designer for their fall-winter Indian bridal wear collection. Another time, I would be interviewing a Bollywood film star for their next film. Or I'd be back to talking to somebody who has seen how AIDS has devastated their lives and just kind of interviewing them and sitting with them. And while this made for quite an interesting life, what it was actually doing to my heart was quite different. And in my bid to get my next big story, I often found that my heart was getting quite hardened. There started to almost be a blindness and a fatigue to the plight of the people I saw around me. I lost my compassion through which I should have viewed their stories. And my experiences in my 20s shaped the way I started to look at poverty and inequality. I moved to Bournemouth when I married Peter, and as he was already living and working here, and in trying to understand this new country I found myself in. Have we got a... Yeah, fine. Yeah. Okay. I moved to Bournemouth when I married Peter, as he was already living and working here. And in trying to understand this new country that I found myself in, I would read lots of newspapers a week. And this was obviously before the massive digital disruption in how we now consume news. But I would read anything from like a right-wing Daily Mail to all the way to The Guardian and anything in between. And I found that the obvious reporting and biases, quite a fascinating insight into British life. But I was not alone, because in January 2012, there were 2 Oxford students who published a paper on how British newspapers talk about poverty. One example focused on housing. And so The Guardian reported that welfare cuts would make 800,000 more homes unaffordable, warning that the poor might end up in benefit ghettos with rising social problems. Meanwhile, the Daily Mail, in the same month, took a slightly different stance. They said something like, for years, you've paid their $2,000 a week rents. But the housing gravy trains hit the buffers, leaving these families to face an overdue dose of reality. You know, newspapers like The Sun and Daily Mail, which reach a lot of people, will use stereotypes like work shy and benefits grouger to describe the poor. They tend to link poverty with welfare dependency and unemployment. And this idea has gotten really deeply rooted in both public opinion and political discourse. Now, we cannot take such a simplistic approach to poverty. And over the past few months, we have been working with Tier Fund to get a better understanding of poverty, which would help us shape Citygate's sort of strategy on social action and global mission. And one of the books that they recommended to us is called When Helping Hurts, which really challenged my assumptions and perspective on these issues. We often think of poverty as a lack of money or material things, like we see in the films or read in the news. But poverty is so much deeper than that. It is a breakdown of relationships, not just a lack of material wealth. What do I mean by this? Let me give you an example that I read in the book. So after World War II, the Allies set up the World Bank to help rebuild the countries that had been destroyed by war. It was a huge success, and Europe's economies grew faster than ever before. So the World Bank thought, why don't we use the same strategy to help low-income countries? So they started lending money to these countries with favorable terms and hoping that it would boost their economies and reduce poverty. But it didn't work as well. Countries like France bounced back, but places like India didn't see the same results. At first glance, the issues were the same. Poverty, hunger, refugees, bad infrastructure, weak economies. But something was different in these low-income countries. The problem of poverty turned out to be much harder to solve than the World Bank expected, and they were very hit and miss. Their results were very hit and miss for years. So in the 1990s, they decided, look, we need a fresh approach. So instead of just guessing what people needed, they decided to ask the people living in poverty themselves. And they reached out to 60,000 people across 60 countries and asked them this one question: what does poverty mean to you? And the answers were gathered in a book series called Voices of the Poor, where the poor described their struggles in their own words. So here's a glimpse of what they said. When I don't have any food to bring to my family, I borrow, mainly from neighbors and friends. I feel ashamed standing before my children when I have nothing to help feed the family. I'm not well when I'm unemployed. It's terrible. When one is poor, she has no say in public. She feels inferior. She has no food, so there is famine in her house, no clothing, and no progress in her family. The poor have a feeling of powerlessness and an inability to make themselves heard. For a poor person, everything is terrible. Illness, humiliation, shame. We are cripples. We're afraid of everything. We depend on everyone. No one needs us. We are like garbage that everyone wants to get rid of. What are some of the phrases that you've picked out from the quotes shown on the screen? Do you see how poverty is described and how people describe their own poverty? While poor people mention a lack of material things, they tend to describe their condition in far more psychological and social terms than people who are not poor that describe poverty. The poor talk in terms of shame, inferiority, powerlessness, humiliation, fear, depression, social isolation, whereas people describing poverty will tend to emphasize a lack of material things such as food, money, clean water, medicine. The reality is that poverty isn't about stuff. It is actually about broken relationships. And what do I mean by this? There are 4 foundational relationships that make up the building blocks of our life. Number 1 is our relationship with God. This is the foundation of everything. It is our first and foremost important relationship. We are not here just to do our own thing. We have been created to glorify God and enjoy a relationship with Him. Secondly, it's a relationship with ourselves. Okay? Each of us have been created in the image of God. This means we have inherent value and dignity. But sometimes we forget that. We either think too highly of ourselves or too little. But when we have a deep understanding of our worth in His eyes, when we are accepted, we are loved, we are secure, we are significant, this gives us a right sense of purpose and worth. The third is relationship with others. We weren't meant to live in isolation. We need each other. God designed us to live in community, to love, to encourage and support one another, whether it is our family, our friends, or a community like this. These key relationships help us live out our purpose. We all have different gifts and abilities, but together we can do something amazing. And fourthly is relationship with creation. The world that we live in matters too. God gave humans the responsibility to care for and manage the earth. This is called stewardship. It means we are supposed to take care of the environment and animals, but also businesses and governments. And everything we do with the world reflects our understanding of it. So these four relationships, connection with God, self, others, and creation, are our building blocks. They influence how we build society, how we create culture, how we form communities, and even how we see poverty. So who are the poor? If poverty is about broken relationships, then perhaps we are all poor in some way. Each of us have been affected by these broken relationships. And that is the reality of living in a world that is impacted by sin. Spiritual poverty happens when we don't experience the closeness with God as He intended. The poverty of being. We don't fully understand our worth and our identity as God created us. Take shame, for example. The voices we heard earlier have shown that people in poverty live with a deep sense of shame, a kind of poverty of being. They feel like they're less than others, and this stops them from believing that they can do better. On the flip side, there might be those who are relatively well off and might struggle with a different kind of brokenness, maybe developing a bit of a God complex where we think we know what's best for people in need, believing that we are the ones to save them. And that's an equally dangerous mindset. A poverty of community happens when relationships with others are broken and strained, and a poverty of stewardship occurs when we fail to manage and care for the world around us as God designed. This understanding helps us realize that poverty isn't just about money. It's about brokenness in these key areas of life. And if we truly want to help people overcome poverty, we need to address all these areas and not just one. Let's take a story that I would read quite often in these newspapers, the story of a single teenage mom who comes from a council estate. Let's call her Jane. What would brokenness look like for her? Perhaps she has a poverty of community. Maybe she has strained relationships with her parents or with people around her. And perhaps the strained relationships caused her to look for acceptance somewhere else, that caused her to get into a situation that she wasn't quite think she would get herself into. Or maybe she had a lack of self-being, her poverty of being. What would her self-worth be like? What's her worth? Maybe she didn't think she was worth anything. Maybe a poverty of her environment. Maybe she grew up in a place where she saw lots of other dysfunctional families, lots of other families that were struggling to figure things out. Or maybe institutions failed her, like schools or social services or communities. Maybe she didn't find that, and there was a breakdown of relationships and poverty of environment there. And maybe nobody ever introduced her to God, and she found she never had the opportunity to experience a relationship with God. Now, if you met Jane, perhaps at a mums and toddlers group or a food bank or in a cafe or an Asda or something, and you got chatting with her, and you become friends, and she tells you, I've just been given a flat from the council. My baby and I are going to move in next week, but I have nothing to fill it up with. And you're like, you know what? I'm part of a fantastic community. Let me help you out. And we send text messages around, and of course, people here will be saying, I have a spare microwave, I have a spare sofa set, I have something, and we are able to pull stuff together between this community. And she has a ready-to-go flat in a couple of weeks. But if we only provided for her immediate needs, we would be actually doing her a disservice. It is walking alongside her for the long haul, helping her work and mend the different relationships that we can truly bring about any real change. Isaiah 58:10 tells us, if you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness and your night will become like the noonday. Spending yourselves often involves more than just giving a handout to a poor person. It's more than a short-term fix that might do more harm than good. Jane's brokenness manifested itself in material poverty. But for other people, the effects of these broken relationships manifest themselves in other ways. For example, I know I have this tendency to prioritize work over so many other things, reflecting perhaps a poverty of stewardship, a broken relationship maybe with the rest of creation. And instead of seeing work as one of the areas that I'm called to, I can prioritize it over other things. And this could have consequences in the relationships with my family, with my friends, and also cause other knock-on effects like stress and health issues. In the past, when this has been sort of brought to my attention, it has made for a very uncomfortable and difficult truth to confront. And I've really had to work hard to bring an intentional change in it. But it's so important that we check ourselves. Why do we want to help the poor? Is it because we genuinely care, or do we want to feel important and accomplished? It is so easy to fall into the trap of thinking we are doing good just to boost our own ego. Even when we have good intentions, we have to be aware of our motives. Because like Romans 7:21 says, when I want to do good, evil is right there with me. If we truly want to make a difference to people's lives, we have to commit to long-term transformative engagement. Sure, sometimes we need to help people immediately, like food and shelter. I did a 2-year stint with the Red Cross just before I joined the team at Citygate, and I just saw this incredible organization come alongside people having the worst day of their lives and just absolutely coming alongside them with food, shelter, clothing right now. And it was just amazing to see. And yes, natural disasters, crisis response, we need to step in with emergency aid. But long-term poverty requires more than that. We need to tackle the root causes, like broken systems and relationships. It's about walking with people and not throwing money at problems. James 2:15-17 says, if a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for their body, what good is that? We need to see people not as problems to be solved, but as individuals made in the image of God, just like us, with dignity and value. Spending ourselves on people bringing long-term transformative change can take years. So I spent 9 years working for an anti-human trafficking organization. And in the beginning, the organization would do things like would gather some intelligence around where children were being sold into slavery or child labor, and we would go in and kind of work with the law enforcement agencies and grab the kids and get out of there, and then start a process of rehabilitation with them. But we found very quickly that the girls were getting replaced, like in a week or two, by other people, and their supply chain was very strong. So we then built a team of lawyers who would start to build casework against the criminal networks who were exploiting these children in these red light districts. And the lawyers would start to kind of put together with the local law enforcement to prosecute the criminal gangs that were involved in the trade. And then as the case and the trials would progress, we would realize that the criminal networks were using the same loopholes again and again to get lower conviction rates, get acquitted, and just kind of continue their work as they did. So we then, after a few years, set up a team of people who started to work with some of the kind of highest powers in the country and would address some of these loopholes through changing procedures and acts so that we could have a better chance in court. And one of the things we realized was a pivotal part in the case or the trial would come up when the girl had to testify in front of all these people, all the people who had abused her. And so can you imagine a 12 to 16-year-old girl walking into a crowded courtroom, having to stand in the witness stand and stare at like 15, 16 men who had abused her in the worst ways and recount exactly what each one had done, and then face questions from defense. So it was that point where we would often find that they would not be able to really tell their story, or would just not show up, or would not be able to really give a convincing answer. And we realized that it was obviously very traumatizing for this young girl having to do that. And so the team worked with this idea of developing this video conferencing facility across a country. Now this is huge, like you're talking about setting up broadband across legal courts. And this is like quite a few years ago when, after COVID, everything's like, yeah, what's wrong with that? But this is like well before when, we had to convince judges that the person who they'd see on the screen is the person on the list. And you had to convince people that the testimony was valid and it would pass the legal precedents and things like that. And so they took a number of years for that to formulate. But I remember doing the first ever video conferencing trial where this girl was able to testify, and we had managed to repatriate her back to her country, and then she showed up at the Indian High Commission in whichever country she was in, and was there with a lawyer and Indian officials, and was able to testify, and we saw an amazing conviction because of that testimony. And as a result of that, it became a precedent, so other cases that we did, we were able to apply for video conferencing, and the children all over the country and in other countries were able to then testify via video. But it also meant that their part in the case normally came about 2 or 3 years into the trial, but it meant that they didn't have to hang around in the city they had been trafficked to. We could start the repatriation process back to their country. You've got to realize that these children had been smuggled in. So there's no paperwork, there's no trail, so you're trying to work out where they are. I remember we had these young boys who had been trafficked into this brick kiln, and trying to get a 7 or 8-year-old young boy to tell you where they live was like, well, I live in this village. It is behind, and my home is behind the banyan tree in front of the temple. And now trying to get that information and work out where in the country their home is. So that sort of stuff takes ages. But it meant that we could start that process straight away instead of waiting for testimony to happen in court and then start that process so their healing could take place. But it took years and years of lots of people going back and forth with government officials and legal stuff to get that changed. And now pretty much any case with a vulnerable child can apply for video conferencing, which is amazing. And finally, just towards the end of my stint there, we gathered huge data sets, and we were able to look at things like AI and things to help us with predictability mapping and say what are the trafficking hotspots in the country, what are the villages that are particularly prone to this, what are the families that are particularly prone to this, and do some targeted prevention work there. But all of this took years and years of work. So it's one thing to talk about a big global issue that has, that is occurring in my instance, in my example, is kind of happening in another country. But we have Ed Briggs, who looks after our community hub that Citygate runs 4 times a week. And he does that with the amazing Sue West, who's our manager, and Bernie Pickering, who's our caseworker. And Ed is going to tell us what it's like to spend ourselves on people.
Thanks, Priscilla. Good morning. It's been an incredible privilege to be part of Citygate's community hub. I work with Sue, I work with Bernie, as Priscilla said, and there's an incredible team of volunteers who keep the whole thing running, and I know a number are here today. And I'm going to embarrass Tony, I know he's here somewhere, who was one of our first volunteers when we opened the hub, and has returned recently to lead one of the teams. Everyone, absolute legends. The hub's mission is Citygate's mission, transforming lives. Our strategy is threefold. So there's relief, there's restore, and there's reform. So let me talk to you about relief briefly. So we provide relief for those in need. We started in April of 2020 in response to COVID. I know that we've all had to repress those memories, but that was a really crazy time. Don't know if you remember, but as well as the pandemic itself, we were kind of on the brink of a social and economic collapse. The supply chain was broken down. You couldn't find basic necessities in the shops, and many folks were cut off from the services that they'd really come to rely on. So my response at the time was to ring my old boss at Bournemouth Food Bank and to say, I think we've got a humanitarian crisis on our hands. Citygate has an empty venue, because we weren't here on a Sunday, were we? And it's right near the middle of town. Let's set up an emergency warehouse and a distribution center here to support the food bank. So that's what we did. We had all this space. We had this incredible team of volunteers, many of which were on furlough at the time, all brilliant folks. And together, we made it happen. Now, since then, we've kind of expanded our vision of what the hub looks like, with longer-term goals. But we never lost our focus on meeting the immediate need of folk, the immediate need of our community: food, shelter, safety, health, all things up on the screen. Summarized on our relieflet. Does what it says on the tin. This is a really simple kind of help directory that we give to anyone in need. There are copies in the foyer if you're interested. So in the last 4 years, Sue West has led the team to giving out over 182,000 meals worth of emergency food. And what a team she's built to sustain such an essential service for so long. Let me tell you about one of our volunteers. Her name's Julia. She says, becoming self-employed in 2022 gave me precious time to volunteer and get involved with my community. The cost of living crisis steered me to Citygate Community Hub's food bank. It gives me so much in return. I have learned hugely from the wonderful food bank team, volunteers, and guests that walk through our doors. Every guest has their own story to tell, their own unique experience, their own perspective. They share their frustration, regret, determination, hope, tears, laughter. I am nearly always surprised by what they tell me. They are teaching me to be patient, to ask the right questions, to listen, to be truly empathetic. After all, never make assumptions. So Julia, like the rest of us, is having her assumptions challenged. And although she's not a church goer herself, she's been one of the most vocal supporters of the need of prayer and spiritual support in the hub. Second thing we're really trying to do is to restore lives, because temporary relief isn't enough. We want lives restored in the long term, and this is where our Casework ministry comes in. It's an opportunity to spend dedicated time listening to an individual's experience and supporting them towards lasting improvements. Every help service out there has their own definition of what a restored life looks like. We decided that we wanted to follow a more biblical model, because God's people, they recognize that in every system, there's people who routinely get forgotten and pushed down to the bottom of the heap. These people, they're summarized in the Bible often as the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner. Just in the book of Deuteronomy alone, they're mentioned 11 times with specific laws designed to protect and promote them. We had a go at interpreting those laws as a measure of a person's practical, relational, and spiritual restoration. So yeah, we want to see everyone restored to a position of love, That's experiencing the care of others without selfish interest. Just as God said to the Israelites, well, I loved you when you were yourself foreigners in the land of Egypt. Provision, sustainably fed, clothed, sheltered. That's the tithing laws and so on in the Old Testament. Justice, to be treated fairly and protected from abuse. These folks, they don't have anyone else to protect them. We have to make that extra effort to give them justice. Dignity, that's significantly contributing towards their own welfare and that of others. The gleaning law in the Old Testament, an incredible demonstration of the dignity of work. And finally, inclusion, to be integrated and appreciated within the community. The law says that every time you celebrate, when you get together, have a festival, make sure that the foreigner, the widow, the orphan, they are welcomed in and they have a place at your table. So Bernie Pickering, as we said, she's now building a team of caseworkers to deliver on our promise to see lives restored. And folks, we're not looking for professionals or specialists in social care, death advice, or mental health. We're looking for compassionate Christians who can pastorally support people towards long-term help from these specialist agencies. Let me tell you quickly about a hub guest who shared his story after a series of visits. He wants to remain anonymous, but I'm going to call him Derek. Derek was rough sleeping through the winter with an infected tooth. One day he came into the hub soaking wet from the rain and sobbing. He was struggling with addiction, not being able to see his own children. And there wasn't a lot that the team could do apart from sit, listen, given the number of a specialist team, and to pray. He said, when you asked if the team could pray for me, I thought, go on, I'll take anything. The next day, I'd been offered some appointments, and it showed me the light at the end of the tunnel. So when you called me again, and I said, you must have been praying. And speaking of the hub team, he said, you are all great. You have cheered me up. You've always been there. You've always paid attention. There are people out on the streets now, and they need someone to pay attention and to tell them that there's organizations and people that can help. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be where I am now. So thank you. Finally, we want to reform society. We're saying, yeah, it's really important to meet people's immediate needs. Yes, we must restore lives to that right relationship with God, themselves, others, and creation. But we also really want to see our community changed for the better. We want to go upstream of the problem and to try and prevent people from falling into crisis. But how can we possibly do that? These are big problems. Who would listen to us? What difference can we make, just a small church community? The answer is we do it together. We do it with others. Our growing list of partners who have brought their specialist services under our roof just in the last month are on the screen for you to see. And together with our other missional partners and with national agencies, organizations like Jubilee Plus, we learn more about our part in changing community and in welcoming in God's kingdom into our society. You see, Jesus' church, C.S. Lewis, I think, describes it really well in his Screwtape Letters. He uses the phrase he describes the church as spread, but through all time and space, and rooted in eternity, terrible as an army with banners. And we look around us, and that is what we should recognize. Jesus' church. And one thing that gives me great encouragement in that is our is our Christmas hamper appeal, and we'll be hearing more about that soon. An incredible opportunity for the church to stand up and to take a lead in some small way. Last year, we had 75 partner organizations, local businesses, community groups, agencies, and so on, that we led in delivering 200 hampers to local families. If you would like to hear more about the hub, about Casework, about hampers, I'm going to be at the back afterwards. I'm going to hand back to Priscilla. Thank you.
That's incredible, Ed, and thank you so much for all your vision and your passion for this. But as we close, I want us to turn to Luke 4 in your Bibles. If you've got one of these Bibles, it's page 131. But if we can quickly turn to Luke 4, and I'm going to read from verse 16. Luke 4, verse 16. He, that is Jesus, went to Nazareth where he had been brought up. And on the Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." I have found that passage especially helpful as I have navigated my own journey and emotions through various roles, paid or unpaid, working in the area of social action. Just sort of revisiting my motives, my heart, but also knowing that there is a mandate and an anointing that comes with spending ourselves on the poor. In my experience, there is like a nudge that comes from the Holy Spirit, a stirring towards something or someone, perhaps an issue or a cause that starts to captivate us. We find ourselves gravitating towards reading certain things or meeting a certain person again and again, or an issue. And we might find ways to respond by volunteering time or sharing our own stories or something from our own career. Sometimes it's not front-facing. Sometimes we could give time to support a cause, doing things like being a photographer, being a data analyst, being a trustee, doing pro bono consultancy, or perhaps just good old-fashioned volunteering and giving. Proverbs 28 provokes us by saying, "He who gives lacks nothing." It doesn't say he who lacks nothing gives. As Jesus says, he was anointed. We are here by his commissioning to be the continuation of his mission on earth. When we recognize that stirring, when we're obedient to that nudge from the Spirit, we will definitely know we carry the anointing as we serve the poor, the oppressed, and the brokenhearted. So how can we respond? There are needs in our community. Our church is situated in a great location. We have two neighborhoods on this side, the Springborn and Boscombe, who are, if you look at any ONS data or any census data, always rank really high in terms of the needs of those neighborhoods. What does that look like for us? I want to quickly show a graph of our kind of work in the food bank. You'll see all the figures in red are the number of food parcels we've given out this year, and the ones in blue are from last year. You'll see from June onwards, we haven't been able to give as many because we've had to shut down on a Wednesday. We haven't had enough volunteers. And so to safely open the hub, we've not been able to help more people in need. Maybe that's something you can do. Maybe, just come and have a taster session at the hub. See what it's like to do that and then see if that's something you could do. Or perhaps we could pick up that principle of gleaning that Ed talked about, of living life with margins. What was that? In the Old Testament, it talked about not harvesting your field right till the end, but leaving space for the poor to come and pick up from. Now, we don't have agricultural fields today, but we do have margins in terms of budgets, time, and resources. how do we reconstruct our lives, leaving these margins so that we have space to spend ourselves on the poor? You know, before I took that job with the anti-human trafficking organization, I spent 2 days praying and asking God, I do not want to do this job because it's an interesting cause or because it might be a good career move. But I want to do it because I want my heart to be broken. I want to see these girls as you see them. And those 2 days were so precious because I could feel God do something in me and break that hardening. And I think it's probably why I lasted so long as I did in that organization, because every time I sat with them, my heart broke for them, and I just wanted to come and spend my time with them and just kind of do everything I could do to ensure that I could see something that would bring some of the broken relationships mended in their lives. So I was wondering if we can kind of just stand and maybe we'll sing a bridge or a chorus of this song. I know we don't have that much time. But just in your heart, say, God, what is it me that you've been nudging? What are the margins in my life that perhaps I need to rejig so that I can spend myself on the poor? Amen.